something about my family history.
We'd like to know a little bit about your family history.
See, one of these days I'm really going to write this all down in a book.
Okay. Well, why don't you tell us a little bit about your grandparents first?
Okay. My grandparents on my maternal side were Adam and Molly Schwach, the Germans. And Adam Schwach was a cigar maker. And Molly was from a family of about 15 kids.
Okay.
All private evening. And growing up, they lived at home with my mom and dad and all of us. We lived downstairs and they lived way upstairs.
And where did you live?
918 Mount Hope
Where was that?
in Cincinnati, Ohio.
Okay.
Famous 918. One of these. Do you remember reading the poem that my mom wrote about 918 Mount Hope? Oh, I'll have to show it to you sometime. But anyway, so on my mother's side in the Schwach family, there was, she was the oldest, Martha, and she had a brother, Albert, and a sister, Luella. They're all gone now, but Sister Luella was a nun, Sister Mary Esther. Uncle Albert was a detective, a hotel detective in Cincinnati, and Al Schwach was his name. So, let me see, on my dad's side I really don't know too much because his parents were dead before I was ever born. Both of them died in their 50s, they were very young.
Do you remember their names?
Yeah, one was Mary Sunderhaus. All I know was
Mary Sunderhaus.
there was a headstone cemetery said Mary Sunderhaus, and that was my name. You know, it looks funny to look down and see her own name there on the headstone. But my dad had a lot of brothers and sisters, and I knew all of them. If you want to know their names.
You know, what else? How about your own brothers and sisters?
Okay. My mom and dad, Martha and George Sunderhaus, they had...
They were born pretty much around the Cincinnati area?
Oh yeah, they were born in Cincinnati and grew up there.
Grandma Sunderhaus?
And Pop went to he was in World War I, and he was a cook. And he could tell so many stories about Army stories. He was a great storyteller. But my oldest brother's George, and then my brother Bob, and then Paul, and then myself,
Okay.
and then Eugene, Jeep, and then Martha.
All right. Adam and Fred.
Well, Adam and Fred were twin brothers, but one was stillborn, the other one didn't live more than a day or so. But how do you know about Adam and Fred?
You told me about it.
You remember that, huh?
I heard about my aunt.
Well, they named them Adam and Fred because my mother's dad's name was Adam and my dad's name was Frederick. And I think they knew the babies would not live because Mom said she wouldn't have pinned those names on them. But now Adam is a very popular name. And Molly is too. That was my grandmother's name, Molly. But anyway, where was I?
So you were talking about you gave all your brothers and sisters, you said your dad was in World War I.
Yeah, my brother Bob died when he was 19, and he was killed. And Martha died,
About 5 years
I want
ago?
to say about 5, maybe 6 years ago. Yeah. And now George is married to Evelyn, and they have Bob and Marilyn and Carol. And Paul is married to Carrie, and they have, Jim and Jerry and Janet and Joanne and Dave.
What
And,
about, now you said
Jeep's wife is not living, Mary Lou died.
you said your dad was in World War I. What did he do after the war when you were growing up as a kid? What was his job?
Okay, he got a job as a burnisher. He burnished silver. You might call it, he was somewhat of a metallurgist, that's what they call it now. But you must remember too, when I was real young, there was a depression. And And during the Depression, you were lucky to have a job.
That's true.
My parents couldn't get any kind of assistance or help or aid because they owned their home. But of course, back then, yeah, they owned their home. It was on paper, but they couldn't make payments. So all the savings and loans companies kind of put the payments on hold until after the Depression was over, because what would they do if they foreclosed on all these homes? But consequently, Mom and Dad could not get any kind of help. Like some places, they either would give out food to families, you know, where there were no jobs, or clothes and things, but they couldn't get any help. So Pop did all kinds of jobs then. Oh gosh, he used to lay railroad ties. He was a butcher. He did, because he knew how to do that from the Army. And you know, if he'd bring home $14 a week, that was a great salary. Can you believe that? That was
Your
tremendous.
mother pretty much was the homemaker, which was a full-time and a half
Yeah.
job with all the
Oh
kids.
yeah, women just didn't work in those days. They stayed home, took care of the kids.
It's still a full-time job.
Oh, yeah,
You know, and
yeah.
I think maybe we've got,
But it was, then it was like, the
Crime.
only women that worked were widows that had to. And then it was very different jobs. You couldn't go just anywhere to work.
crime was a lot lower. Everything was lower then. I don't know if that's not the way to go, but,
Oh, well, I don't know. Crime might have been lower, but there
well,
wasn't that
family
much
values
of a
were a little
population.
higher and everything.
People
I'm
help
just saying.
people, you know, and families. Just like I said, my grandparents lived with us when we were kids. When my mom and dad bought their house, they bought it with the idea that they would take her parents to live with them. And when I met Dad, his was just about the same way. See, his parents more or less took care of his grandparents.
You're looking
you
at
know.
your new abode here, Mom. I'm just kidding.
No, but see, in those days, they didn't have Social Security. And so what would the old people do? You know, except be sent to the poorhouse or something, so the families took them, the loving families. I'm sure there were many of them that were probably pitched in the poorhouse. But, is there anything that I forgot to tell you? Oh, I told you Martha's not living, and her husband George died
Right,
quite a while ago.
Right.
And they had 3 children.
yeah,
I told you Jeep has 3 children.
right.
We're still great friends with them. You see them, love to get together with the kids.
Sunderfest.
Nieces and nephews, and every August at the Sunderfest.
Really, that's what we really wanted to find out was, you know, I had no idea that, about
You
your.
knew my
your-
dad was in World War I, didn't you?
Well, I think so, I remember now, but I didn't know what he did, you know.
And he worked in silverware all of his life.
How about one famous story about your dad and one famous story about your mom, and then we'll call it a close.
The greatest about my mom is, the funniest in the world. Well, I mean, it's
Tell
probably
the
not
camera.
funny to anybody except we that knew her. Because Mom had false teeth, see? And so they were the kind that she would have to put the sticker on them when she went out to put them in so they'd stay in place. And so when she came home, she would just take them out, you know, and set them down. Well, daggone, one day she was making vegetable soup, you know, cutting carrots and celery and potatoes and everything. And the people next door, the Whitskers next door, had an egg business where they sold eggs, so consequently they had a lot of chickens in their backyard, you know. So we would take any scraps that we had over and throw them to the chickens. So she said, hey Mary, gather up all these scraps, come on now, and take them over to the chickens. So I took the cabbage and the carrots and the tomatoes and the celery, all that remained, you know, after she was preparing the soup,
Her tea.
in a big bag or something, took them over and threw it down the hill for the chickens. Okay, came back home. 2, 3, 4 hours later, we were all getting ready to eat supper. Mom couldn't find her teeth. Needless to say, Oh my gosh, did we throw them out with the chickens, when we threw the food. So Jeep ran over, he was just a little kid, he went, "I'll go, Mom." And he ran over, came back, and daggone if he didn't have the teeth in his hand.
Oh, no. Oh, my gosh.
Never forget that. That was,
Were they still
they
together?
were okay. Yeah, she just cleaned them and was thankful. I think she prayed real hard to St. Anthony. She loved to pray to St. Anthony. She was a very religious person,
Okay. What about your dad? What's a famous story about your dad? You got lots of classics about him, I know.
Oh, probably. You know what a great joke and storyteller Uncle Jeep is.
Was your dad
My
just
dad
as good?
was just as good. And he would never forget a story. And he could never forget a joke.
See, Jeep's the same way. He doesn't forget them either.
And Pop would, we all, like at Thanksgiving, we'd all be sitting around the table, and we'd say, "Oh, Pop, George, tell us the one about this and that when you were in the Army." Most of them were Army stories, And he'd tell it, and he'd do the sound effects and the dialects. And
He did all that stuff.
great storyteller. He really was. But, my dad was very strict. And I must say, I didn't really, I guess growing up I was a little scared of him. Because he did yell a lot, with all those boys. And in those days, I guess it wasn't, you had to be strict. Germans were pretty strict. And so when he came home from work, he wanted no one to talk at the table. He wanted peace and quiet. And of course, here I am with these 4 older brothers, and they're wild kids and like to play and have fun. And
3 older.
3 older brothers, yeah. But if he'd get mad at him, he'd whip up his belt, and he'd take off after him. I don't think he ever hit him with it, but that's all he had to do was take the belt off, and oh boy, did they transform into little angels. And I'm afraid, little Mary, I get just as scared as the rest of them, although he never ever, don't remember him ever using it.
Blasted you.
No. But I was scared to death of him. And I was in high school before I really got to know my dad. And how I got to know him so very, very much, we had a father-daughter. I was in Seton High School. We had a father-daughter dance. And I said to Mom, "Oh, Mom, he won't go. I know he won't go." And I just kind of think maybe she might have begged him and pleaded with him, "Go with Mary. She wants you to go to that dance." And he did. He said he'd go. I was thrilled because I was running around with a bunch of girlfriends, and all their dads were there. And he got up and danced with me. I didn't know my dad knew how to dance.
Had a great
And
time.
he talked, like I was his sweetheart, From that day on, now that's terrible to get to high school. I wasn't afraid of him, But up until then I thought, oh, he's so strict, and if I say this or that, he'll yell at me, But from then on, I could do anything I wanted. I was his special girl.
That's a neat story. I
But
didn't
I
know
don't-
that. See, you just find that out now.
But I don't know very much about jokes.
But I know
I
that's
know
great.
he used to tell one of them.
That's classic. I didn't know that about Grandpa. I wish I'd have known him.
Well, Kevin,
Grand-
don't you remember him? You weren't that,
The classic,
little.
the only thing I can remember about Grandpa Sunderhaus was the time we were down in the basement throwing the spitballs or the things against
And
the
he
wall.
was mad.
Oh, he went bananas, but he didn't go bananas me. I was too little.
Let me tell you this. I'll never forget one of the very last times I saw my dad was, Mike must have been 3 years old. Now, Mike was a lot different than the rest of my kids. Most of them were, you could get them to settle down a bit. Mike was into everything. He didn't have a shy bone in his body, truthfully. And I was very concerned and very worried. And I'll never forget my mom, my dad said, "It's down there in that kitchen." I went down one weekend, and it must have been like a week or 2 before he died. He says, "Don't worry about Mike." He said, "He'll be okay. Just give him a chance. He'll be okay." I always remember that.
Don't worry about
So,
Mike.
I
Have you
hope-
ever told Mike that?
I don't know if I ever did or not, because I just was thinking of it now, but I'll tell you,
Well,
I hope he's up there looking down on me.
and the one thing that we just wanted to say is, I mean, not to dwell on it, but so your dad passed away in what year? I mean,
He was 70 years old in 1960.
1960.
And Mom died in, what, 64?
I think 1964.
Yeah, and Grandma McCurdy died in, or Grandpa died in 78,
78
and Grandma in 82.
and 82.
Uh-huh.
Okay.
Different, though they were different people, they had a lot in common.
They
Bob
sure
and
did.
Dad's mom and dad and my mom.
Okay.
Thank you very much,
You're welcome.
Mary.
Okay, Mary Regina.
Now we
Mary
got
Regina.
Agnes, Sunderhaus,